Hey, so this is our third video for chapter 24, fluid balance, and we'll talk about electrolyte balance in this video. So the physiological functions of electrolytes are that they're chemically reactive and help participate in metabolism. They determine electrical potential, which is the charge difference across cell membranes. So think about the resting membrane potentials and how electrolytes play a role in that. They also strongly affect the osmolarity of body fluids. And because of that, they affect the body's water content and distribution. So electrolytes can be either positively charged, which would make them cations, because remember we talked about this before. My cat is positive. So that's how I remember what a cation is, whereas major anions are negatively charged. So sodium is arguably the most important electrolyte within our body, although all the other electrolytes we really couldn't function without. But sodium is one of the principal ions that's responsible for the resting membrane potential. So remember when we talked about cardiac or when you learned about nerve impulses, sodium plays a really big role in depolarization. So sodium is also the principal cation in extracellular fluid, and it accounts for 90 to 95% of the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid. So this means that it's the most significant solute in determining the total body water content and the distribution of water among these fluid compartments. It's absolutely critical for this chapter for you to understand how sodium or other electrolytes, how they play a role in distributing water. So really think about how this determines osmolarity and how it impacts osmosis. So the sodium gradient is a source of potential energy for the co-transport of other solutes such as glucose, potassium, and calcium. And this is because there's something called a sodium-potassium pump, which is an important means of generating body heat. I'm not going to go into detail about the sodium-potassium pump, but do know that sodium is a way that the body creates energy to co-transport other solutes. So the primary concern with sodium is excretion of excess dietary sodium. So as you can imagine, especially in today's diets, we take in too much sodium. So the sodium concentration is going to be coordinated by several hormones, and this includes aldosterone, which if you remember, this is secreted by the adrenal glands, and you should know exactly where in the adrenal gland, because that was just on your last exam. And aldosterone is called the salt retaining hormone, and this plays a role in adjusting sodium excretion. So hyponatremia and hyperkalemia, which is respectively is too low sodium or too high potassium, will directly stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Hypotension can also stimulate secretion of aldosterone by the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. We'll talk about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism with the urinary chapter. So aldosterone is a steroid and binds to nuclear receptors. Remember, it can actually go on to the DNA. And this causes kidney tubules to reabsorb more sodium and secrete more hydrogen and potassium. Because of this, water and chloride will passively follow sodium. So the primary effects of aldosterone are that urine contains less sodium chloride, but more potassium and generally has a lower pH. You need to remember the primary effects of aldosterone. So here is the actions of aldosterone. Definitely remember how this plays a role and what the end point of aldosterone really is. So elevated blood pressure will inhibit the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So that means that kidneys will reabsorb almost no sodium. We talked a little bit about ADH before. You definitely will need to know ADH for this exam. But ADH will modify water excretion independently of sodium excretion. So the endpoint of ADH is that kidneys will reabsorb more water, and remember how aquaporins fit into this. Um, and this would further slow an increase in blood sodium concentration. Natriuretic peptides inhibit sodium reabsorption. Natriuretic peptides come from the heart, and they will inhibit water reabsorption because they inhibit the sodium reabsorption. They'll also inhibit the secretion of renin and ADH and will cause the kidneys to eliminate more sodium and water and will then lower blood pressure. Other hormones also play a role in regulating sodium. So, for example, estrogen is able to mimic aldosterone, and this would cause sodium and water to be retained. Progesterone will reduce the sodium reabsorption and has a diuretic effect, whereas glucocorticoids can promote sodium reabsorption and edema. So, what I want you to know is that these other hormones do play a role, although knowing their exact role is a little less important. So, sodium homeostasis is achieved by regulating salt intake, and sometimes this will result in salt cravings in humans as well as other animals, where if you're not getting enough salt because you've already excreted it all, then you're going to want something salty. So imbalances in sodium are relatively rare. So hypernatremia will be when plasma sodium concentration is greater than this given value. I don't expect you to memorize this value, but know what hyper and hyponatremia are. And this could be because of the administration of IV saline, or it could be from something like water retention, hypertension, or edema. More common is hyponatremia, where plasma sodium concentration falls below the normal value and the person loses large volumes of sweat or urine, and they replace it with drinking just plain water. So this means that there would be excess body water, and then this would be quickly corrected by excretion of excess water. So one example of this would be why athletes who are really being athletic and sweating a lot, why they would want to drink something like Gatorade. So potassium is also another very important cation, and the functions of potassium are to produce resting membrane potentials and action potentials of nerve and muscle cells, including the heart. And this is the most abundant cation of intracellular fluid. Remember that sodium is the most abundant cation of extracellular fluid. And it is the greatest determinant of intracellular osmolarity and cell volume. So we talked before about the NA, the sodium-potassium pump, and how important it is for thermogenesis, and plays a lot of metabolic roles. And potassium is also an essential cofactor for protein synthesis and other metabolic processes. So potassium homeostasis is very closely linked to sodium homeostasis. Most of the potassium within glomerular filtrate is reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule, and the rest is excreted in urine. The distal convoluted tubule and the cortical portion of the collecting duct within the kidney will secrete different amounts of potassium in response to blood levels. Take these two facts and just stick them in your back pocket and come back to them when we talk about the renal physiology, and we actually talk about what a glomerulus or glomerular filtrate is, and we'll come back to these ideas. So aldosterone stimulates the renal secretion of potassium and plays a role in potassium balance. So potassium imbalances are the most dangerous types of electrolyte imbalances, and these can be hyper or hypokalemia. So hyperkalemia has effects that depend on whether the potassium concentration rises slowly or quickly. So if it rises quickly, which could come from like a crush injury, the sudden increase in extracellular potassium will make nerve and muscle cells abnormally excitable, and this could produce cardiac arrest. So when you say crush injury, again, remember that the intracellular potassium is higher than extracellular potassium. So if you squish those cells, it's going to release all of that potassium into the extracellular fluid. However, if it's slow onset, it inactivates the voltage regulated sodium channels, and the nerve and muscle cells will then become less excitable. So hypokalemia rarely results from dietary deficiency, but generally will result from excess sweating, chronic vomiting, diarrhea, excessive laxative use, aldosterone hypersecretion, or alkalosis. And this would make nerve and muscle cells less excitable. So this could result in muscle weakness, loss of muscle tone, decreased reflexes, and then heart arrhythmias from irregular electrical activity within the heart. Chloride is the most abundant anion in extracellular fluid and contributes to the extracellular fluid osmolarity. It's required for the formation of stomach acid, which is hydrochloric acid. And we talked a little bit about the chloride shift that accompanies the carbon dioxide loading and unloading in red blood cells. And it also plays a large role in regulating body pH. So if I were to ask you what chloride does, these would be the main functions. But I would say that the absolute major role of chloride is regulating body pH. So the homeostasis of chloride generally is achieved as an effect of sodium homeostasis, and this is because there's a strong attraction to the cations, because chloride will passively follow because of its negative charge. So as sodium is retained, then chloride ions will passively follow. So that's all you need to know about chloride. And then calcium. Calcium is another very important cation, and we talked a little bit about calcium before. So calcium strengthens the skeleton, activates sliding filament mechanisms and muscle contraction. So remember that from our cardiac muscles. It also serves as second messenger for some hormones as well as neurotransmitters, activates the exocytosis of transmitters and other cellular secretions. So that means that it activates the actual release of neurotransmitters into the synapse. And it's also an essential factor in blood clotting. So cells maintain very low intracellular calcium levels, and this is to prevent any sort of calcium phosphate crystals from being created. But the phosphate levels are high within the intracellular fluid. So this means that cells need to pump out calcium so that they can keep the intracellular concentration low, or they sequester calcium in the smooth ER and release it when it's needed. So homeostasis of calcium is chiefly regulated by PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, or parathormone that comes from the parathyroids, calcitrol, which is also vitamin D, and calcitonin. All of these hormones together affect bone deposition, reabsorption of calcium, as well as intestinal absorption and urinary secretion of calcium. So hypercalcemia can be caused by alkalosis, hyperparathyroidism, or hypothyroidism, and this would reduce sodium permeability on the membrane, which inhibits depolarization of nerve and muscle cells. When there's very high concentrations, there can be muscular weakness, depressed reflexes, and cardiac arrhythmias. Hypocalcemia could be because of vitamin D deficiencies, diarrhea, pregnancy, acidosis, lactation, hypoparathyroidism, or hyperthyroidism, with very, very low levels resulting in tetany or death. We will continue the next lecture talking about acid-base balances.